Thanksgiving, though it's only a few hundred-year holiday in the United States, it's a several thousand-year holiday in the Jewish tradition, which is to always acknowledge the blessings and the gifts in our lives. Which, on one hand, sounds like a simple act, a simple decency, that when a person is blessed, someone does a favor for you, or God does something for you, it's just a common mental thing to do, the decency to say acknowledge and say thank you. Yet, as we shall discuss, there's a lot more profundity to the concept of appreciating our lives and appreciating those that have helped us in our lives, and obviously also being on the receiving end of appreciation for things we've done for others. So, as an opening question, as I sent out in the weekly email that we update, the weekly class update email that describes the topic, it's an issue that I deal with very often. It's a question I ask myself, a question I ask many people. A simple 3-word question: do you feel appreciated? Actually, it's 4 words. 4-word question. Do you feel appreciated? Most people, interestingly, may not surprise you, just as you probably feel this way, do not feel appreciated, or feel underappreciated. That's the more correct term. Many of us feel that things that where we paid a price, and we've directly helped some individuals, whether it's family members or strangers or colleagues, were never fully acknowledged or appreciated. Some of us feel taken for granted, and some of us even feel abused, often by people we feel we've helped. And of course, the more difficult question to answer is: are you also guilty of the other way around, of not appreciating others? Because if we're the only ones that are like so-called the victims, then someone's not doing the appreciating, are we also part of the problem? That's the question. So it's an interesting question to think about, whether the people in your life that have come around and in one way or other helped you, whether you've really expressed appreciation, whether you feel appreciation, and so on. So when we are told in the Judaism, we say thank you, for example, simple, someone serves you food at the table. So there's an expression in the Talmud that says, which in Aramaic means the wine belongs to the owner, but the tivusa, the thank you, has to go to the waiter. Because you could argue, what's the way? The waiter is just serving me. He didn't produce the wine. He didn't manufacture the food. All he's doing is delivering it from the kitchen to the table. But the fact is, he's the one that's serving you, so he deserves a thank you, even though you can claim that you're thanking God for the actual gift of food. Which simply means that no matter who it is, even if it's someone that's just an intermediary, or like a waiter, or a interface, or any other type of translator, so to speak, that delivers the mail to you, deserves a thank you because they did a service. But what really lies behind it, besides the common decency, as I mentioned, everyone understands, you say thank you, it's a normal thing to do. And people should thank us for something we've done. But there's something deeper here, which also, of course, addresses the bigger question: why is it that so many of us feel underappreciated? In other words, why do so many people lack the basic courtesy of thanking us and appreciating or valuing us in our lives? And this can be either loved ones and family members, this can be, as I said, strangers, it can be co-workers, employees, employers. I mean, the list goes on. So it really touches upon a deeper issue about, we'll call it, lack of a better word, narcissism, selfishness. Obviously a person who's very self-consumed has less time to thank people than someone who isn't. Which means if everything is about me, so that doesn't mean that some of us have the etiquette and the decency to thank, and we'll also thank people, especially if we benefit from it. Someone benefits. But that type of sensitivity to other human beings, the value, the validation to give another person, I would submit, is very much predicated, and you can even say proportionate, to how self-absorbed we are. The more self-absorbed we are, the less we're going to really be sensitive to other people. The less we'll recognize the need to be sensitive. Unless, of course, it serves us and our selfish needs. So this so-called malady of people not being appreciated and not appreciating is linked far more to who we are and what drives our lives and what is really the driving engine of a person's psyche and soul. Now, psychologists and philosophers from the beginning of time have debated this issue, whether we are fundamentally selfish human beings or not. Because a very strong case can be made that we are. We see it from the moment the child is born, especially in an early age. A child only knows about its needs. It cries when it's hungry, when it's in pain, when it's tired, when it's not feeling well. There's no courtesy. There's no such thing as a child saying, oh, you know what, my mother's tired, or maybe I should hold her back. A child just naturally cries out. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the child is in any way guilty of that. That's the way a child is created. It's not like choice. But one could argue that that type of attitude remains with us throughout our lifetimes, because we're essentially self-interest-oriented people, meaning everything orbits around me and my needs. And therefore, all we can really be expected of us is that we should somewhat temper it, somewhat not be raw, hardcore narcissists, but to live and let live, so to speak. So we create our so-called superimposed rules that allow us to coexist, which sounds like a decent thing to do. And some cynics will even say that that's superimposed. It's not really natural to us. So this is a big question, because if we are fundamentally selfish creatures, Richard Dawkins wrote his classic book. Richard Dawkins, of course, the radical atheist. The title of the book was The Selfish Gene. That word, the selfish gene, making the case that genes are selfish. All they're driven by is the cardinal rule of existence, which is survival, preservation, self-preservation, and which, of course, is the ruling principle of all evolution and natural selection. That every creature and every life form has one rule, the most important rule of all, is to survive, and hence the principle of survival of the fittest, which is those that are most fit, most powerful, most ingenious, most cunning, will be the ones that survive. And the competition between different organisms and between different life forms, all fighting for the limited resources. This is a common principle. This is a given, an axiom in today's science. So, applying this to human beings, we're also part of the creatures of this world, so we too are driven by the selfish gene. And he makes the case, as do other scientists, how we just look at how genes multiply, how cells grow, and you see that it's all about they do whatever it takes for them to survive. Which of course leads us to the moral question: can you really blame somebody for being selfish then? Can you really prosecute someone for being selfish? So we don't really have a complete answer, but the answer usually given is, listen, selfishness is inherent in us. What you could do is, you could call it a crime if your selfishness spills over to the point that you actually hurt another person. Whether it's violence or theft or murder or any other form of abuse, that is unacceptable. But if you really think about it, you could ask a skeptical question: why is anyone really blamed? We don't blame predators in the wild for hunting prey, for hunting down the weak. That's part of the natural balance. Why is it with us humans we expect more? So the general answer, the conventional answer, is because we have no choice, or else we'll just destroy ourselves through war and through battles if we don't have some type of common red lights and green lights. But there's nothing inherent in these laws. Well, as antithetical to that, as the ultimate diametric opposite to this approach, of course, is the Torah approach. The Torah approach, from the beginning of the Bible, from the beginning of the Torah, and the whole basis of Judaism, is based on a principle that we are not fundamentally selfish. Period. We are fundamentally created in the divine image. And therefore, that means that we are fundamentally actually selfless people. People who will search for transcendence, to search to get beyond ourselves and put ourselves aside in serving a higher cause. Putting ourselves aside in loving another. So love, transcendence, service is far more inherent to the human condition than is selfishness. That's basic Jewish principle. However, part of the purpose of existence is that there be a battle. So we have another voice inside of us, which is the selfish voice. So we have a selfish gene and we have an unselfish gene, basically. And they're at war. They're at each other's throats. And that is the battle that defines our entire life. How will you behave in every given moment? Will it be following the selfish gene within you, or will it follow the selfless one, the transcendent one? And the more powerful one is obviously the inherent one, but the selfish one is put in there in order to create this type of like equal balance with the objective of us overcoming the challenges of self-absorption and becoming selfless creatures. That doesn't mean that we are compromising our needs and compromising our identities or annihilating ourselves. It means that we become greater people, not when we take, but when we give. This is basic Jewish principle. So when you think about Thanksgiving in that context, there's of course the superficial element of Thanksgiving, besides the Macy's Days Parade and the balloons and the sales. There's the element of thanking. But there's a deeper element. It really means when you're really a person that's thankful for everything that comes your way, you're not just being a nice person, you're actually acknowledging that it's not all about me. There's a sensitivity to a bigger picture. You're blessed to be put on this earth. You're blessed to be given life. Everything that came your way is a gift, and never take for granted that you just deserve it all. A sense of entitlement. So it cuts much more into the heart, into the core of what makes us human beings. Now, that's just a small introduction, so to speak, to discuss a little more in depth. And why do we have to go more in depth? What's wrong with what I've said till now? Isn't that deep enough? Some may wonder. Well, the reason we have to go more in depth is because it's all easier said than done. It's all nice, everything I've said, everyone could agree with, at least much of what I've said. And if you don't agree, obviously feel free to rebut this either in an email or in any other way you'd like to communicate. But the reason that this needs a little more discussion is because, as I said, it's easier said than done. Well, if it's that simple, why don't we just turn on the switch of the selfless switch and become more divine and transcendent, and therefore become more sensitive and giving and appreciating, etc. Because it's not that simple. The battle is strong, and we are, in most cases, our own worst enemy. So the question is, what makes it difficult for us to embrace and to grow and improve our lives? Why is it that we find relationships difficult? We find validation in this world difficult. We find, whether we're on the receiving end or on the giving end, all the issues I mentioned before about appreciation, why is it that difficult? So of course, one of the basic answers for this is because we're insecure people. In addition to the fact that we're selfish, we could be selfish, we also are insecure. So you combine selfishness and insecurity, you get yourself a very volatile combination, it becomes increasingly difficult to get beyond. Some will even argue that we're not really selfish, we're insecure, and therefore we become selfish. If, for example, a person has to fight all their lives for recognition, or for their piece of bread, or for a piece of turf, obviously they're going to become very clingy and needy, and when they finally have something, are not easily to give it up. So you could argue that basically the concept of existential insecurity in our lives, that as we grow older, we realize that there's no one really going to take care of us. Even people that love us don't always know how to love us, or not always around, that we become increasingly self-reliant, and self-reliance borders on really just protecting yourself. And when you're busy protecting yourself, you become more blind to other people and to their needs. And with a good argument saying, listen, I've got my needs, your problems are your problems, they're not my problems. Who's going to take care of me if I take care of you, so to speak? So one could strongly argue that in a world like ours, which is a cruel world, a hostile world, and some of us have suffered more than others, but everybody somewhere has been impacted by other people's selfishness, that we then in turn become ourselves very much self-reliant and thus more insulated and less sensitive to other human beings. Therefore, we need to discuss this a little more and really come to some type of suggestions and advice which is really what the Torah is, not just to analyze the problem, but to give us suggestions, solutions, of how a person can actually become more in touch with themselves, more secure with themselves. Because that, to go back to appreciation and the idea of being valued, what it touches on is another fundamental issue, which is the dignity of a human being. From a Torah perspective, following the axiom I mentioned before, that we're fundamentally divine creatures with the capacity and the need for transcendence and love, and putting ourselves aside actually to seek something greater, a second axiom grows out of that axiom. A second corollary would be the right expression, and that is that each of us has an inherent dignity. Using the model that I mentioned before by contrast, that's called the evolutionary model of the selfish gene, one can make a strong argument that the reason that every organism is so busy with preservation, self-preservation, and survival is because it doesn't feel secure. It knows if it doesn't kill, it will be killed, basically. So in a world like that, we develop a very strong need of constantly being vigilant and being aggressive, because if not, we may be killed. Which is, of course, a type of, it's quite sad to consider that creatures on this earth basically walk around, whether they show it or not, constantly in fear. Because that's what it means. It's fear. It's fear of death. It's fear of annihilation. And thus, survival becomes the simple driving force. But imagine for a moment, it's always good to do these mind exercises, even if we're not there, to dream and imagine. Imagine if every creature on this earth was absolutely secure with its value. It knows that it has value no matter what happens. And no one can take that away from you because no one has given it to you, only God. And you have nothing to be afraid of because you will always exist as a result of that value. In other words, your preservation is not based on whether you kill all your enemies or not. You have value. To put it in a little more subtle terms, psychologically speaking, you find people that always need to make sure, for them to be right, everyone else has to be wrong. You ever see people in any type of discussion or argument, they're always busy showing how everybody else is wrong. Now, a very secure person who has a good position and a strong position, intellectual position, doesn't have to necessarily show how others are wrong. All you got to do is make a case for what you believe in and then feel secure and confident in it. Why do you have to knock everybody else? Knocking others is the first sign, whether people are aware how transparent they are when they do it or not is another story, but it's the first sign of a person that's very insecure. Because they cannot coexist. You have to be wrong for me to be right. Think about that. Which means, essentially, that we're driven by a fundamental insecure state of mind, state of being, when in truth, if you really do have an inherent value, and you're not aware of it, it's quite tragic. It means you're not aware of the thing that is the most important thing, that you deserve value, you deserve to be appreciated. The fact that nobody appreciates you should not in any way weaken your confidence. Now, this doesn't justify or in any way minimize the pain if somebody does not say thank you. But I can tell you many people who feel underappreciated, even though they may be right, but they're also wrong. What do I mean by that? They're right that other people should have said thank you. But the reason they dwell on it, and it becomes such a painful thorn, is because they suffer from insecurity themselves and are constantly dwelling when I don't feel appreciated. And the real goal is not to get everybody around you to say thank you, it's to get you to be in a place where you don't need to be dependent on it. That other people have to be appreciative is absolutely necessary. But that you should be dependent on other people's valuing you or not is itself a sad commentary. So a major part of really studying Torah, a major part of really embracing what God wants of us, and I would say maybe the greatest gift that God has given us, and that God itself, the concept of God gives us, is that we have inherent value. And nothing takes that away. Our stocks don't go up or down based on other people's whims and moods. Our value is not based on performance, on our performance, on buying power, on looks, on youth, on equity, on all the other status symbols that people consider to be so important. Your value is based on you and your soul. The mere fact that you exist means that you have inherent value. Which is why we need more discussion. How do you connect to that part of yourself when we're constantly being bombarded and inundated with messages that invalidate us? And not to sound like a fire and brimstone here, but the fact of the matter is, basically we are inundated, especially in our information age, advertising, whether it's on television, radio, internet, all forms of streaming media, texting. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there's constantly messages coming to us, and those messages, in most cases, are trying to sell us something. Which really means, if you think about it psychologically, it means it's telling you that you're not complete without this thing, and therefore you should buy it. You're not beautiful enough, you're not driving the right car, you're not hanging around the right places, you're not traveling the right, etc., etc. That's what it is. Now, I'm not suggesting every product is valueless. Some of these products are valuable, but a lot of them are not necessarily something you need. So we're inundated. They say, statistics say, by the time we're 20 years old, an average American has seen 1 million advertisements. Seen or read or heard 1 million advertisements. That's an awful lot of messages. You have to wonder what 1 million messages have, what that does to our being, our psyches. And the question is, do we have 1 million counter messages that are telling us that you are inherently valuable? I would submit not really. But that's the message. The message is that if you don't do this, you don't do that. And the message comes to us, besides the media, from society itself. The people we meet, the parties we go to. Happy Thanksgiving, Rabbi and Rebbetzin.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
All of you too.
Yes.
And may you have much to be thankful for.
Amen. This is our host, so I'm thanking Rabbi Metzger and Rebbetzin Metzger. He's the Chabad of Midtown, Magil. Anyway, so society and all its pressures, and wherever we go, there's like, what do you look like? How you dressed? Do you fit in? Don't you fit in? Style. You name the whole list. The list goes on. Which perhaps is why the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, begins with the following statement. Before any laws are stated, it states with a principle, a piece of advice. The advice says, Al yevush mipnei habaligim. Do not be embarrassed for those that will mock you. It's the opening statement in all Code of Jewish Law. Which really means, do not be affected by others, basically. You are valuable because you're valuable. And find out what your value is, and hold on to it for your dear life. Because not others can define who you are, and in other words, not others should define who you are. You shouldn't be busy with your entire life trying to satisfy or make somebody else happy. You have inherent value. This, to me, is more than any other thing what makes the Torah unique, what makes God unique. Because without this statement, everything else becomes arbitrary. How valuable, how indispensable could your investments be? Could your time be? Could all your involvements be if you're dispensable? So it all comes down to your own inherent value, which we are all is our birthright. It's our God-given birthright. And actually, the founding fathers of the United States, though Thanksgiving is a little earlier than that, but they stated in the Declaration of Independence in their own words. They call it all men are created equal. Say all people are created equal, and all have inalienable rights endowed upon them by the Creator. That's the words of the Declaration of Independence. The Creator is used. Created equal, and by the Creator. Why? Because they understood, even though they were deists, and they were not advocating a religion, mixing it with the state, yet they understood that the foundation of a true democracy, of true freedom, is that there has to be some unwavering foundation, unwavering principle that nobody can change, that guarantees everybody inherent value in the pursuit of happiness and the freedom of speech and the other expressions of freedom that the Bill of Rights guarantees. Because if you leave it up to human beings can say, you know what, there's some more equal than others. So it had to be something that was divine, and they put it into the Declaration of Independence, so no one can come and no majority can vote, can change that, because it wasn't decided by a majority, it was decided by the Creator. And this they saw not as a religious statement, they saw it as a moral statement, as a fundamental principle a constitutional principle that is the foundation of this country, actually. Nobody could ever change that. So that even guarantees the right for a person to choose not to be an atheist, to be a non-believer. Because the dignity of every person's inalienable rights includes the right to deny God, but never the right to deny other people's rights. So this principle is the foundation of the entire Torah. That's how it begins. So when you think of it that way, then the question and challenge is, so what happened? Why then are we such insecure creatures? Why don't we just feel this inherent value? And how different would our lives be if we were driven from that type of, jealousy, hatred, anger, carrying grudges, being consumed with what other people tell you or don't tell you, would all disappear if you felt every second that you just have inherent value that's gushing from within your soul, and who really cares what other people are saying or not saying? But we're not that way. We are social animals, and we are impacted all the time. So that's why we need a little more discussion, not just to talk, but to really figure out what kind of tools can we access, instruments to access that inherent soul within us, which is essentially concealed. So we're born with it, and then it's beaten out of us. As we grow from birth to children and to adults, we become part of a world that teaches us to be insecure because everyone else around us is insecure, and they project it upon us. People lie all the time. Why would a person need to lie? Why? Because they're either ashamed of what they did, or they're insecure with what they did. A person who's completely confident could say, listen, I made a mistake, and I now regret it. I'm just giving you some simple examples. So we have in this week's chapter a very fascinating episode that becomes even more fascinating when you read the discourse in Ayin Beis. And Ayin Beis, as I mentioned many times over this year, is an acronym, really means 72, but it's referring to a treatise, a epic, Hasidic, Kabbalistic, mystical, and spiritual document that was authored and delivered 100 years ago this week. It's actually a series of discourses that began Shavuos, which would be around May 1912. So May 2012, just a few months ago, was this beginning of that centennial. To honor it, I began teaching it. I teach it every morning, and there's a whole YouTube channel dedicated and a website, a wiki spaces website dedicated called Ayin Beis. It's pretty heavy stuff. I teach it in text, but it's if you're interested in a nice journey into the beyond, just taste it. So every morning I give a class, and then we post it on YouTube. So YouTube is now being inundated with Ayin Beis. Doing a little inundation. I'm trying to reach 1 million messages by the time you're age 20 with Ayin Beis. That will counter the 1 million advertising messages. I don't know if we'll get there, but I'm working on it. So this Ayin Beis, as I said, is a flowing discourse, a series of discourses, and continues as well this week. And this week, Pasha, in the chapter we're reading, Vayetze, Vayishlach next week, the Ayin Beis addresses a very cryptic and puzzling episode here at the end of the chapter that we're reading this Shabbos this week, and explains it in, as I said, in the most fascinating way. And I'll try to do justice by summing it up. But first, the story in the Bible itself. And as we always know, the principle I always base this on is, as I said earlier, the Torah means the word Torah comes from the word directive. It's like a blueprint for life. Essentially, it's a relevant message to us today. So even though the episodes and the narratives and the characters lived and played out their lives thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, actually it's a part of the world that is right now going through its own upheavals, the Middle East. So we have here the story that even though it happened back then, its relevance today is as relevant today as it ever has been, as we shall see. So there's the technical story, and then we'll talk about some questions, and then it's ultimately the spiritual, psychological, and emotional and personal meaning. So the story begins as the chapter begins, Vayetze. If you're familiar with the Torah's general story narrative, you know the book of Genesis, which we are now in, which we began reading after Simchas Torah, the end of the holiday season, the beginning of the Jewish year. So it goes in chronological order, begins with Bereshit, Genesis, the beginning of creation. And these chapters continues the chronological order after the first 10 generations from Adam to Noah, next 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, then it slows down and begins to talk about each of these individuals. First, Abraham, who in a pagan world, in a dark world, finds light. He basically is the father of monotheism, discovers God in a dark world. In turn, he had a son called Isaac, and his story is told in the previous chapters. And Isaac, in turn, had two sons that I discussed last week. Elah told us Yitzchak, the two sons, the twins, Esav and Jacob. And the end of last week's chapter is the whole story how Esav is in fiery rage, murderous rage, wants to kill his brother Jacob. As a result, and Jacob also at the same time also was of age to find a bride for himself, get married, find his soulmate. So his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, tell him to go to Haran. Haran is a city where Abraham actually originated from, somewhere southeast of modern-day Iraq. And the chapter begins, this week's chapter, Vayetze Yaakov miBeer Sheva. Jacob leaves Beersheba. Beersheba is a city in Jerusalem, in the Negev. And Beersheba is where Isaac lived and where Abraham had lived. This was their hometown in Israel. And he goes Vayelech Harana, and he goes on a journey, basically southeast, a journey to Haran. And the famous story of Jacob falling asleep in the beginning of the journey and having the classic dream, the famous dream of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, where God comes to him and promises him that he will protect him, that he will build a family, and he will return in peace to his homeland, to the home of his parents, which means Israel. As a result, Jacob wakes up, realizes that he's in a holy ground, sacred ground, and Jacob, talk about Thanksgiving, he thanks God. He actually takes the stone upon which he rested, where he slept on a stone beneath his head. He makes a marker. This is very important to the whole story. He makes a marker called a matzeva. He anoints the stone. He pours oil on it. It's a type of offering, thanking God for his promises. And with that, he embarks on his continuing journey, and he ends up in Haran. In Haran, I'm not going to go through all the details, but basically in Haran he meets first Rachel, who he falls in love with, and then approaches her father Laban, who's his uncle, who's Jacob's uncle. Laban was a brother of Jacob's mother, Rebekah, and he asks permission to marry his daughter Rachel. So Laban, as we find out quickly, is a cunning, shrewd, corrupt, smart businessman, and he says to him, yes, if you tend to my sheep, be a shepherd, which was his basic living, his income. He was a shepherd. You tend to my sheep, and he had thousands of sheep for 7 years. With that, you will earn your right to my daughter Rachel. Well, Jacob does that. He works for 7 years, and then Laban fools him, and instead of bringing Rachel to the chuppah, he brings Leah, her sister, which is first deception. Maybe not the first, maybe the second. Anyway, like a long story short, he ends up working another 7 years for Rachel. The whole story, he's busy tending to Laban's sheep. He makes Laban very wealthy. Jacob himself is also majorly successful. There's a whole story of how he actually breeds the sheep and creates different types of sheep of different spots and stripes. There's a whole episode about that. And finally, after 20 years of being by Laban, and at this point Jacob had also had all his children except one, Benjamin, the last of the 12 tribes, would be born in Israel later. All 11 boys and one girl, Dinah, all the tribes, basically the foundation of the nation of Israel, our ancestors were all born in Haran, of all places. And after 20 years, Jacob finally decides, time to go back home. He knows Laban is not going to make it easy for him, because Laban always had another trick up his sleeve. So one night, he packs up everybody, his family and so on, and makes off. When Laban sees that his son-in-law with his daughters and the families escape, he pursues them, and this is how the story ends. And after